Hey, you found us.
This is the Spiritual, Not Religious Podcast with your hosts, Shaun
And Shawn.
Enjoy. All right, you ready now?
No, now I'm completely deflated. I gotta build myself back up. Bum, 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 bum. Welcome to podcast number 4. We're excited. We are actually broadcasting from our Asheville studios today. And a lot of exciting things going to happen on this podcast, Shawn. What do you think?
I'm really excited about this one.
I am too. It's going to be good. And for all of our listeners out there, we want to say thank you again for tuning in to this podcast. You might find yourself wandering in the spiritual deserts of your life. And here's a place of rest and healing. And you know what? Hopefully, just some good conversation.
Yeah.
That's good, Shawn.
Oh, hold on. Oh my God.
You guys get nervous in front of me or something? Got that red light nerve.
I know it is.
It's real.
Oh, man.
It's going to be okay, buddy.
I'm so nervous.
Are we going to do this again?
I don't know what to say.
All right, Shawn. Welcome to our podcast number 4. Thanks for... That's what we're talking about. You guys are amazing. We just have the best audiences. We really do.
Yeah.
We are actually shooting live. No, we're not live, are we? We're just shooting from our Asheville studios
we're live right
today.
now.
We're on the road. We're on the move.
Yeah. Taking the podcast on the road.
And we hope everyone out there is just encouraged by this podcast, because we are wanting to create a place and space for those of us who are wandering in the spiritual deserts out there. And you're looking for some rest and some healing and, just plain good conversation, Shawn.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's about time we start digging a little bit deeper into those conversations.
Well, I hope you brought your shovel.
Oh, don't you worry, son. I got my shovel.
Hey, listen, this is a podcast specifically for 18 to 30 somethings, but really it's for everybody. Whether you find yourself at the end of life,
Wow, at the end of life.
I just didn't want to be, ageist about it. I just figured that just sort of like, hey, if you're feeling like you're not having a whole lot more time, but you still care about these things, hey, you're welcome here. So I'm just trying to be inclusive, Shawn.
Inclusive all the way to the end of life.
All the way to the end. And for those of you who are just born and you have no idea what you believe,
Goo goo gaga.
then you're welcome here as well. But hey, if you are desiring to grow deeper in faith and just spiritual ideals, but you're not connecting with the places that offer those kinds of opportunities, then we are glad you're here, because this is your kind of podcast. And we just want to be a place for young adult voices and all voices, whether they're about to be deceased or just joining us, can be heard regarding their thoughts and feelings about the church, about religion and God, Jesus, all things spiritual. We want to be that kind of place where church and religious leaders even can come and listen to how they might be able to better engage this crowd of religious leaders that can come and listen to how they might be able to better engage the young adults who claim to be spiritual but not religious, right? And furthermore, we want to be a podcast for those who believe that positive change is already occurring. We don't want to be a Debbie Downer of a podcast.
Yeah, I think that's like one thing we need to hammer home is we're not sitting here just like yeah.
Feline AIDS is the number one killer of all cats and churches. Yeah, so no, we believe that there are a lot of really positive things happening out there, and we want to lift those up as well, and bring hope and excitement for these generations who they're just not connecting with the business as usual approach from a lot of churches these days. And so if you are listening and you're experiencing the kind of change and growth that has changed your mind about claiming to be spiritual but not religious, we want to hear from you. We want to hear from you regardless. So please shoot us a message there in the stream below as you're listening. Make sure to subscribe. Also, you can email us. And Shaun?
That email is ask.us.snr@gmail.com. And I checked it yesterday, Shaun, and there is 0 messages. So.
I know. People aren't messaging us. They are just being filled with everything that we're saying, and it all makes sense, and they have no questions. We're doing our jobs is what that means. So, but in case, anyone changes their mind about that, please reach out to us or leave a comment below, and let's begin a conversation. And so in this podcast, we've got several things that are going to happen. We're going to continue to look into a series of points, and we are on point number 2, based on the research done in the book called Faith for Exiles, which was written by Ali Hawkins, David Kinnaman, and Mark Matlock, who found that today's young adults find these 3 points of utmost importance regarding their spirituality. 1, and we talked about this on the last podcast, many want to find a way to follow Jesus that actually connects them with the world they live in. And then today's topic will include this point, number 2. They believe that God is more at work outside the walls of the church than inside them, and they want to be a part of that. And then point number 3, they express a desire to be a person of faith without separating themselves from the world they live in. And so as we focus on point number 2, the young adults believe that God is more at work outside the walls of the church than inside them, and they want to be a part of that. We're also going to look at an article published earlier this year by The Guardian, and that this article, Shaun, we've been reading it, has got some really revealing stats that we want to discuss. And then finally, we are excited to be introducing our very first podcast guest, who's going to be joining us for the remainder of this podcast to offer his insights. And so at this time, we want to offer a very warm welcome to our good friend and former ministry leader, Zachary Suggs.
Hey guys, great to be on the podcast with you. Always a pleasure to sit down with you and talk shop.
All right, we are really excited to have you on here, Zach. And just a little bit of background for our listeners. Zac Suggs is someone that I have known for a very long time. We met early on in one of my youth ministry gigs, and Zach was very much a part of the ministry leadership team and youth, and I've just known Zach ever since then. But he's a former ministry leader, has served in several different contexts within the church. Zach is a well-traveled guy. He's been all over the place, and he brings a breadth of experiences. But I know that with Zach, his faith journey is going to be one we want to talk about, because I feel like a lot of people are going to be able to identify a lot with what Zach is bringing, and we're just really glad that you're here. And so we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts and a little bit of your backstory of faith and experiences within the church. And so,
when was the last time that all 3 of us were together?
At your wedding, at Shaun Winburn's wedding.
Mm-hmm.
SW.
And so, that was last year, last November. We were all kicking it. So
dang, we almost made it a whole year.
Yeah,
we're almost there. Yeah, I'm still married too. Yeah,
we're still hanging. Year wiser.
Well, that's debatable. Oh gosh,
we need to get old Melissa on the podcast, man.
Oh no, we have so many guests that we want to invite on here. Zach gets to the distinguishing
first guest award.
Numero uno, yeah.
So we're really excited.
I'll be expecting a T-shirt.
You will get one as soon as Shaun finishes making one.
Yes, it'll be all 3 of our faces together.
yeah, and then part of just our history, it would be a tie-dye shirt, right?
Yeah, there we go.
Because that's what we used to do in youth ministry. We just made our own tie-dye shirts. Perfect. All right, so Zach, we're going to jump into this point number 2, and we want your thoughts on this. And so these guys, the authors of the book Faith for Exiles, say they believe that God is more at work outside the walls of the church than inside them, and they want to be part of that. And so let's get your thoughts on that statement, just what comes to your mind, what jumps out at you. And again, these are thoughts and feelings from a generation that just believes that, hey, listen, I want to connect with God. I just don't think it's happening inside the walls of the church.
Yeah, a lot of experience on that, especially from my last post out in Seattle, Washington. My wife and I moved out there and started a family, and I was the director of worship and connections in young adults, which the young adult side actually led to a lot of these findings, in the sense that when I was interviewing for the position, the executive pastors were talking all about how, the young adults were so hungry, so excited to, start a young adults ministry, that there hadn't been one established by the church yet. And we had a lot of people just lining up at the door wanting to, be a part of this group. Mm-hmm. And I, with plenty of notice, launched a young adult group, sending out invites to every single young adult that was in the church registry and saying, all right, you asked for it and here it is. So here's going to be the big, unveiling. We're going to have a gathering. We're going to talk about where we're going to go, what we're going to do. I was even planning, short-term missions trips and service projects and, tons of other, fun gatherings, things like that. Mm-hmm. And, I swing the doors open expecting to see this horde of young adults, and I had 3 people show up. And this is from a church database that was 3,000 strong. Wow. As far as the general populace, my young adults were ranging in like the 300, 350 from that 3,000. Wow. And, only 3 people showed up. And from there, we actually tried to have a couple of other gatherings afterwards, saying like, oh, maybe people are just waiting for like a couple of gatherings to happen to kind of knock off the edges and break the ice, and then I'll show up to the 3rd. So we arranged at least 4 or 5 gatherings after that specific one, the opening, and still only the core group showed up every single time. And even outside of fun, like let's just go to the movies, I tried it all. I tried movies, I tried a game night, I tried let's meet together and let's go downtown and just talk with people, love on people, bring some extra change with you, or bring your wallets with a couple of dollar bills, whatever, and just like let's go around and let's spread God's love. And yeah, just that core group of people. So it was perplexing to me. It was very, very confusing. But then I started digging in and really having conversations with these young adults. And what I found was eye-opening, in a sense that what we're talking about today is real and tangible in the young adult population. And really I could stretch that out, and I can almost blanket that over the general populace of the church, the attendees, in the sense of there's a feeling of this cyclical motion and this like unstableness, and also just this boredom that's overreaching the general populace of the church. And it's definitely reflecting in the numbers. It's reflecting in the ministries. And I mean, take a look across any of the churches that I've interviewed with past that or before that posting, and a lot of the things that they were trying to address was we're trying to get the millennials and Gen Z and, the folks that are a little bit older back to church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just for clarification, you're how old?
I am 31.
31. All right.
Yeah.
So that kind of puts you at the tail end of a millennial.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And so this work that you were doing with this particular church, and what did you say you were doing this?
I was outside of Seattle in a town called Sammamish.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And fairly large church that you were serving, but just no connection or very little or minimal connection with this young adult population. And it just seems like both the attractional and even spiritual aspects that you were trying to bring to the table for these young adults just wasn't having them gravitate towards what you were trying to do. And just you feel like you're at a loss at why.
Yeah, it was a feeling it was definitely a feeling of like, what am I doing wrong? Like maybe I'm portraying myself more of like, let's just have fun and let's not make any difference in the world. But that was the thing, was like that we were advertising, hey, we want to be more than just a group of young adults going to a brewery and reading the Bible. Like we want to go and be the hands and feet of Christ and really make a difference in the world. And that was met with the same lack of enthusiasm as a movie night. So yeah, it was really strange. Granted, I mean, I'll throw that number out. Granted, it was 2021. We were coming out of the pandemic. The church was still seeing kind of a gradual uptick from the loss of attendance during 2020. Everyone going to online, and everyone actually sticking to online. A lot of folks were really just getting comfortable, especially millennials, especially the Gen Z, actually preferring online church to in person, because I feel like that's something that social media, that's something that just the internet and these kind of realms of like boxing ourselves in, of kind of isolating ourselves. I feel like a lot of things have kind of influenced us to place that on church as well and say, oh, I can get Jesus, I can get the Holy Spirit, I can get all the things that I need from church at home and from the comfort of my pajamas and a cup of coffee.
Don't even have to get dressed. Yeah.
And we can't underestimate enough the impact of COVID and the pandemic and the effects that it's had on the church globally.
Yeah.
Well, that's what this article opens right up with, is just talking about the impact of COVID. It was kind of like that was what started the descent in the numbers.
Right, and we're going to get to that article here soon. But in this conversation about wanting to find more meaning outside the walls of the church than inside, the church just being closed down. It was hard to do anything inside the church.
Yeah.
Except for, attend in your pajamas to a Zoom service. And but even before COVID kind of changed everything, and especially afterwards, this lack of a return to the church, finding more meaningful things outside of the church is really interesting to me. And I'm also just curious, with your experiences in trying to engage young adults outside of the church, saying, hey, let's go minister to people out on the streets downtown. Let's go get our hands dirty, which was something that we talked about in our last podcast, where was an ideal that young adults had of, we don't want to just hear, we want to be doers as well. Yeah. And we want to get our hands dirty. We want to do something meaningful. We want to be part of changing the world for better.
Yeah.
But you didn't seem to have your hands being able to wrap around getting young adults to go get their hands dirty. Was there anything there that...
Yeah, I think, to be honest, looking back at it and, praying about it and really just kind of meditating on the fact, I think after a while, especially being out of leadership and just kind of being out of the church bubble, and having conversations with, the folks that I work with outside of, church walls and everything. I think it's really a factor of shame, to be honest.
Shame.
I think a lot of young adults, I think a lot of millennials, a lot of Gen Z, even some, folks that might be ranging in their 40s, 50s, are feeling an overwhelming sense of shame in the church, in what it stands for, in what it has been doing, what it has done. Sort of these exterior stereotypes that have been forced onto the church, whether they like it or not, of being homophobic or being overly judgmental towards just anyone and everyone. I think there's a fair amount of folks that want to do good, but they don't want to do good under the label of the church. They just want to do what is right and not really start a conversation about, hey, I believe in this guy named Jesus, and I do this and I do that, and I listen to the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit told me to come down here and to talk to you and to serve you and to do all of this. It's, there's that disconnect because they feel, a fair amount of the folks that I've talked to, they feel that the moment that they mention that they're Christian or that they believe in Jesus or that, this is something that the Holy Spirit prompted them to do, the people just automatically kind of label them as judgmental.
Like it delegitimizes what they're doing.
Exactly. Yeah, which is crazy because it's still happening. People are still, doing good. And honestly, like, who cares what the label is? You should just accept it in a sense,
Right. Good is good.
Good is good, yeah. But for some reason, that is being kind of forced on the folks that do label themselves as Christians. And I think that's a huge de-incentivizer for, young Christians to go out and to be associated with a church
mm-hmm.
and do good things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we can talk ad nauseum about just several of the failings of the church or just some of the discrepancies that the church has has done throughout time. Our brothers and sisters in the Catholic Church, they're going through this, global ordeal, with a lot of scandal. And that has lost a lot of folks who don't want to be associated with something like that. There's a lot of scandal and hypocrisy in the church that a lot of people don't want to be a part of, or that there's idealizations that that people don't want to be a part of. And that the moniker of Christian carries a lot of weight, both good and bad.
Yeah, there's even an article that I just pulled up on my phone from Pew Research talking about that by the year 2025, there's going to be $150 million that will be embezzled by the church if it follows the current statistic. And so a lot of people are looking at that too and are saying, okay, they're taking our money on Sundays and they're, stuffing it in their pockets. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Right. And we wonder why people aren't attracted to what the church is doing.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stories coming out that just are disheartening and are casting a lot of mud on the good name and work of this guy named Jesus, that I think a lot of people don't seem to have a problem with Jesus and Jesus's teachings, and but they certainly have a problem with Jesus's followers, and I think that's a reason why a lot of folks are spiritual and not religious, right?
Yeah.
And so, how do you see us moving forward, Zach? I mean, what is a way forward here? How can we get young adults to start thinking differently about changing the church. We did a quote by Shane Claiborne last week where he says, hey, we're going to stop complaining about the church we've experienced and try to become the church that we dream of.
Yeah. Gandhi, be the change you want to see in the world.
So how do you see as a millennial on the far end of that spectrum, how do you see us being the change of the church that we dream of? Do you what gets your wheels spinning? Where do you think would be a good start?
I think it's really just getting off the couch and actually doing what we are complaining about, with actually making a change. I think that's another thing that's kind of promoted a little bit of laziness. Is the same thing is our phones. We're able to get on social media and rag on a product or a place or an organization, and yeah, sure, like people will hear that, people will see that, but it's usually followed up by like, okay, so what are you going to do about it? And I think a lot of the people I've spoken with have the sense of just kind of abandoning the fact and saying, well, it's a sinking ship, I'm not gonna go down with it. But really it's like, okay, but if you believe that we're supposed to be the church, this global C church, we're supposed to find some way to revitalize it and to actually help it thrive. I think it's a matter of getting past that shame that I spoke about, which is a process. It's it's something that therapists work with people all the time about shame in their lives and how just how horrible shame can be on a person's psyche and a person's life in general. I mean, Dr. Brene Brown has a really fantastic talk about shame and just how it affects us and affects organizations and affects pretty much everything. And I think, it's a sense of diving into that shame, what it makes us feel, how to reverse that, and how to really just stand up for what we believe. I think there's a calling back to the simplicity of biblical standards, of not kind of swaying and bending to cultural norms, but to actually revert back to the plain and simple words that Jesus spoke and Jesus asked us to live the way that he asked us to live. And it's really a factor of just actually getting up and doing that and actually listening to his words and taking them to heart.
But then the interpretation of what you just said varies widely across the spectrum of churches, right?
Yeah.
Some people will hear that and say, yes, we need to revert back to ancient biblical practices, and here we are. And a lot of those practices could be very harsh, and minimizing the people that are welcome into these churches. And other people will hear you also say that and say, yes, we do need to do that, and we need to be more inclusive, and we need to be more loving and less judgmental, and all of these things.
I think there's a big picture issue too. I think there's a big picture movement that you and I have spoken about on multiple occasions, where there's a cycle of reformation in the church. I think it's every 500. Was it 100?
Every 500 years.
500 years. We're coming up on that if we're not already in it right now.
And we are. Mm-hmm.
Where that stagnation, where that rumble that's might have started a few hundred years ago is finally coming to fruition. A lot of people are starting to feel that and starting to either get scared and leave, or buckle down and say, okay, I'm not moving, I'm not budging. Your boomers that are sticking with the church, that are giving that 10% or more to the church and saying, this is how we get the church through this movement, through this rumbling, is we stick with it. We pour our funds into it and everything that we need to, and we just stay the course. and then we've got another, bunch of folks, which I feel like spurred by the social movements and the civil rights movements that have been happening in the past couple of years. I feel like the millennials and Gen Z are latching to those movements as well as what's happening in the church, and just kind of on kind of like a slide scale, blending all of those movements together and saying, okay, like I see you walking out of the church, I'm going to follow you, and we're going to make a difference, like, and show the church what's going on.
Right. And this timeline that you're talking about is a timeline of about 500 years. The church goes through a major shakeup, a change, something larger than the church itself happens, and large scale shifts tend to happen. And so last 500 years was the Reformation. And then this 500 years looks like another shakeup. And so we're hopeful to see where it goes. But again, we want you to be part of this conversation. That's why if you can just fill out your thoughts and comments on that, or email us.
I would even say email the podcast. And I know, Shaun, you and I speak all the time about, at least once a year, we ask each other the question, what does your ideal church look like?
That's right.
We sit down over a beer or whatever, and we talk about that. And it usually stays pretty consistent with what we talk about. There's like subtle differences that tend to arise like through the years as we get wiser and older. But I know it stays pretty consistent of, what we think a church should be. And I think that's a great, thing to email in and ask Double Shaun about, and just kind of give your thoughts about, hey, sit down. If there were no restrictions, if there were no things standing in the way of your ideal church, like walking in on Sunday, what would that look like?
Exactly.
Or Monday or Tuesday.
That'd be a cool segment too, to read out, different people's answers and see how they differ.
So there you guys are. Start sending in your responses. We'd love to hear from you. And before we go to our break, I do want to just mention, as far as young adults finding God outside of the walls of the church more than inside, I've had the experience with working with two nonprofit organizations, Appalachian Service Project, which we've mentioned here on this broadcast before, as well as Warren Willis Camp and Conference Center down in Central Florida. And there I had the privilege of working with college students and getting to know their story. And these were a lot of folks who would be the ones to say, yeah, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. But they had found meaningful work doing these jobs. So at the camp, it was working with kids of all ages and trying to give them a safe place to have fun and to learn about Jesus. And for Appalachian Service Project, here are young adults who are leading groups into doing home repair in low-income housing all throughout the Appalachian region. And again, people who found that this was their church, was doing this service work. And I would ask them, well, are you plugged in a community of faith back home, or while you're in college, or wherever you are when you're not here during the summer? And it just keeps coming back to the same thing. No, this is my church. This is what I do. And I think a lot of people do that. And maybe their church is, I actually go whitewater kayaking, and that is my church. I'm communing with God in nature, and this is where I find a connection with God. I don't necessarily feel that inside the walls of a church. I feel it outdoors, or I feel it when I'm doing work with nonprofit organizations or volunteerism, or helping others in some way. That's where I find the most meaningful church experience. And then maybe inside the walls of the church, they're finding a lot more judgment or criticism for not wearing the right clothes, or you just brought in coffee onto our holy green carpet. How dare you walk in with that? Or you're not the right color skin. Or I'm sorry, you're a what gender? You're not welcome here because of that. all kinds of reasons that they're finding more meaningful experiences, more meaningful, faithful experiences outside of the church than inside of the church. And I think that's something that church leaders need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, there's that definite lack of trust. And trust is so crucial in an organization, in a relationship. I mean, if we like to call ourselves family, we like to call ourselves, the body of Christ. If one part of the body doesn't trust the other part, then there's no correlation.
There's chaos.
There's chaos, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think it's interesting that these young adults, they are finding things that are making meaning for their lives by serving kids, by serving families whose homes are getting repaired. And they see God at work in those situations, whereas they don't really see those kinds of miracles, those interactions where it's like, now we see God. It's not just hearing God through a worship song or through a sermon, which you're probably going to get at most churches on a Sunday morning, which is great. It's not bad. It's just maybe there could be more. And what does that look like?
Well, action builds trust. Like, if you lose trust in someone or something, then, you can just perpetuate that by removing yourself from that relationship and not pursuing any sort of action. Or you can actually put your hands in the dirt and move forward, use, what was done to you or what happened or what you heard about or whatever, and use that as a building block towards building that trust again. And I think that's why a lot of those kids are seeing the action of the quote unquote church. Mm-hmm. And that itself is building that trust back, but not in the traditional frame mm-hmm. of what we think church is. It's expanding that, I think.
Right. And so if you're listening to this podcast and you are finding your experiences with God outside of the church, let us know what those are. We'd love to hear them and share them with our other listeners. And we will take a break here and come back with our second segment where we're looking at this article from The Guardian. Right. It wasn't something organic that happened at all.
No.
Interesting. Wow, we're having a really good conversation here.
Just keep it going.
Mm-hmm. And we're back.
Oh, we can start back and we can talk about it more. Yeah.
No. Let's get into this conversation around The Guardian and how it outlines the growing trend of dying churches, religious disaffiliation by younger generations, and some of the reasons for this growing trend. And so we're going to be kind of working off of this. Let's see what I do. Lean away from the mic. Lean in. I don't know why I do that. I need like a chair that just forces me forward.
You've got a Shaun.
Thank you,
That's
Shaun.
what I'm here for.
Yeah, so this is an article that was written by a guy named Adam Gabbett. And again, this is from The Guardian. And the title is Losing Their Religion: Why U.S. Churches Are on the Decline. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this. And I'd love to get your feedback on this, Shaun and Zac, and how some of your experiences will inform some of your opinions on this piece. So, all right. So one of the things that we start off with, and you had mentioned this earlier in the podcast, Shaun, was the fact that COVID was a wrecking ball, not only just worldwide and for a variety of reasons, but specifically in this context for churches. Churches closed down and people stopped coming. And when they opened back up, there just wasn't the floodgates weren't reopened and people were all returning in droves. Quite the opposite has happened. And he mentions churches that have closed. He says about 4,500 Protestant churches closed in 2019, which just before COVID. and this was the last year the data is available, with about 3,000 new churches opening. And so it was the first time in the number of churches in the U.S. hadn't grown since the evangelical firm Lifeway Research started studying this topic. So we got churches that are closing, and people that are not really returning, even on things like Zoom and other versions of connecting live. People just aren't returning.
I remember so vividly when COVID hit, because I was in a leadership role at a church, specifically for the youth ministry, and it was so sad to see how there were certain kids that coming every week to youth group was their their realignment, right? Like that was their chance to kind of get recentered, grounded, to be around people their age, to be around adults that genuinely cared for them. And once COVID hit, everything moved to Zoom, and very regularly you would see them the first 2, maybe 3 weeks on Zoom, and then they were gone. They wouldn't be signing in. And unfortunately, what seemed to happen is, once in-person church kind of started back up, you would rarely see those kids coming back. So it was like something that they had been started to get into a routine with was just completely, knocked out by COVID. And, if that's looking at it from a really small perspective of just a couple kids that are at my youth group, I can imagine what it was like globally for the church as a whole. I mean, even for adults, right? So, yeah, COVID just, like you said, it was a wrecking ball. I mean, it really, it threw a lot of things out of whack.
Yeah, I mean, just in, there's an article for COVID-19.nih.gov saying that since 2020, nearly half of Americans surveyed reported a 10% increase in rates of anxiety, depression, substance abuse disorders, things like that. 10% is huge if you're looking at, just a study that is rating half of America. And I think a lot of that was that isolation.
Yeah, it was just being alone.
Yeah.
And I don't think too many people were keen on the artificial connection and the artificial communities that were built online. I think those are helpful in small doses, but when you're trying to do work that is very relational, that is very communal, that relies on touch and face-to-face conversation and doing things side by side, that's just not going to be tenable in a place like a faith community. And I think that was a huge reason why a lot of people just kind of dropped out. But what I'm curious about is now that we're returning to face-to-face and being in large numbers and groups together, why hasn't that translated into people going back to church?
I think, every crack starts somewhere, and I feel like, kind of reverting back to that 500-year Reformation, there has to be some sort of start of the seam, breaking. And I think strangely, and, giving my personal opinion, my personal stance on the matter, I'm actually a huge activist when it comes to bringing church outside of the building. And so, I mean, this shakeup is actually something that I see as promising. And I think, and I've spoken with several church leaders and have expressed my opinion, and that opinion has been met with disdain in a sense of like, no, we have to save the church. And I've been telling them, I think COVID was huge for the church. I think it was a step actually in the right direction, because I think it forced people, I mean, outside of the obvious, you know, speak to you, Shaun, of saying like that it was a huge hit to people's mental well-being, and I'm not saying that was amazing, because that's not good by any stance, but I will say in the frame of mind when it comes to the church, I think it was kind of a kickstart, because
You
if
got
you're
people like outside of the building itself.
yeah, because I think if you're so focused in on, let's look at a wall of bricks. I think if you're so focused in on one brick, you're so close to the wall. COVID was a sense of like us actually having to step back and see the wall in its entirety. And I think that's where we notice the crack. That's where we notice the movement. That's where we notice what's happening and what needs to happen. And I think, you know, a lot of people see it as, oh, COVID was horrible for the church, when, in my opinion, and this is not, you know, backed by anyone else, it's maybe backed by a few people that agree with me, but
I don't know, after this podcast, and
yeah,
people
maybe.
might be saying, hey, no, we're right with you, Zach.
In my opinion, it was the beginning of the end of what we think church is, what church was, and, you know, it's more focusing on, making us focus on what the church should be.
Yeah, I would agree with you that it's beneficial in the sense that you're taking the people of the church outside and you're putting them in a real world scenario, right? So it's really easy to talk about things, you know, in practice, but then actually putting those things into action, that's a completely different situation. I think, like what you're saying, is that COVID kind of forced people to do that, right? You know, my stance has always been, for me, if you are with a group of people that have, you know, you don't have to agree 100% on everything, but if you are with a group of people just fellowshipping, right, and you're talking about, you know, your faith, that to me is church, right? You don't have to have four walls and a roof for it to be church. So, I mean, I would even agree with you in the sense that, yeah, like I can see your point that it's beneficial. But that's interesting that, what's that? Oh, yeah, we're good. But I can see your point that some people who have a more traditional stance on that would see that almost as like a personal attack on them, right? Because you're like, what you're saying is it's like, well, we don't really need to do things the way that we've always been told, right?
Yeah. There's a worship leader out of Bethel Church in Redding, California, where I was also leading worship out there, but he was one of the more known worship leaders, but he actually left Bethel, moved to LA, and during COVID started a movement called Let Us Worship. His name's Shaun, and he's seeing remarkable things happen with his nationwide touring. So basically what he's doing is he's bringing a band with him, he's bringing speakers, and they're basically having church outside of the wall. I mean, their motto itself is the church has left the building. And
that's cool.
It's being met with so much energy, so much excitement, and also a lot of people coming up against it, whether it's, you know, actual churches saying, no, like you should be having church, you know, in the building, doing the traditional way, doing the traditional things. And also it's being met with what's happening in the United States. I mean, we can't disregard the movement of Satan, the power of Satan. That's one of the most important things for a Christian to know, is that Satan himself is still very powerful in the world. And, you know, that's actually something that Let Us Worship is bringing to light, is there's countless attacks, there's countless actual like threatening letters that he's been getting. People have actually been showing up and protesting at these events. There's people, Satanists, that are actually starting to organize a counter tour where they go to the same cities that Shaun's going to, and basically holding their event right across the street from Let Us Worship. And so it's bringing to light a lot of things that are happening in the world. And I think that's another huge reason, another huge case for the church having to leave the building, is that we're actually starting to encounter, things that are going wrong, which, within the walls of the church, you rarely see that. Everything's perfect. Everyone is so encouraging and happy, and things are going great.
Right.
And the sleeping bag drive went fantastic, and we gave 10 sleeping bags out, and everyone was so blessed by it. And it's just like outside. Yeah.
Satan's he's not gonna waste his time on something that's not a threat to him.
Exactly.
Right.
So and it's funny how history repeats itself. This is nothing new, right? And I'm thinking of the theologian and minister John Wesley, who had a big hand in kind of spearheading this whole new church, where he was trying to revitalize the Church of England, and he took his church outside of the church. He was ostracized. People would throw rocks at him. They would throw vegetables at him for how dare you take church outside to these heathens in the world. And then next thing we know, we have a whole new church forming, which is now the United Methodist Church today. But, the point being that here we have someone who didn't see God inside the walls of the church, felt led to take God outside of the walls of the church, and the response was overwhelming. And it's just really interesting that you bring that up. And then, kind of finishing up that point with COVID, this article mentions while COVID-19 may have accelerated the decline of the church, there is a broader, long-running trend of people moving away from religion. In 2017, Lifeway Research surveyed young adults aged between 18 and 22 who had attended church regularly for at least a year during high school. The firm found that 7 out of 10 had stopped attending church regularly. And he talks about reasons that could have been logistical, like they moved away, or they got a different job and that had something to do with it, or maybe they started having kids and just the timing wasn't working out. But he says that one of the top answers for church members or for young adults leaving the church, and this is before COVID, right, seems to be judgmental, or that church members are hypocritical. The younger generation just doesn't feel like they're being accepted in a church environment, or some of their choices aren't being accepted by those at church, as the leading reason why so many young people aren't going to church. What are your thoughts on that, guys?
Well, how much of that is generational? Because not trying to be I'm not trying to compartmentalize church staff, but very regularly, I mean, like the age of people who work in a church, it's very different from the younger people that are part of the congregation. So it's like, what part of that is generational, where you have baby boomers and sorry, Shawnee, but like older Gen Xers. I'm not a baby boomer.
Gen Xer, bro.
I said older Gen Xers.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
What'd you say?
But and then you have your young millennials and your Gen Z, and what is that divide in those generations? The thought process, the way that you're raised, the your viewpoint on so many different social issues, and how you view the world. So I think, unfortunately, what I think is that no matter where you're at, this could be in whatever job situation, whatever business situation, I feel like the people who are in charge subconsciously kind of impose their beliefs and their the way they look, the lens that they look through into how they do their job. And I think that shows through a lot of, people that are kind of running the show, per se, in a, in a church setting.
So what's the answer to that, Shawn? What would you, if you had the chance to talk with church leaders who might be of an older generation, what would you say to them?
I think it just comes down to having hard conversations. And I think now more than ever, I think it's really hard for people to see eye to eye. I think we live in a very polarized world. And I think that, that's the question, is what is the answer? Because if I had the answer, then
well, I think
we'd be doing what the answer is. But that's why we have these conversations, though, right?
Well, yes, it is. And I think if you're a church leader and you're listening and you're wondering, what is a potential idea to contemplate to bring before the board or your elders or your deacons or whoever needs to make these decisions, how do we incorporate young adults into more leadership positions? How do we give young adults more voice within our church context? Because I think what happens is maybe you get the token youth person on your church leadership team.
And see, I think that's what happens the majority of the time is you have your token youth person there, but then they're shoved in the corner. Mm-hmm. And it's like, you're here for looks. You're not actually here to put genuine input into this conversation.
Exactly.
I think it's going back to the subject of trust too. It's these the older generations that are not trusting because they're seeing the Gen Z millennial folks in the workspace, and they're seeing them as unreliable. They're seeing them as these folks that just aren't living up to their expectations, which every generation does that. Every generation looks back at the generation after them and says, oh, they're going to be in charge one day. I can't believe it. Like, the world's just going to fall apart. And I think we need to stop. If I could talk to,
yes,
the older generations, yes, I would say we need to trust that this generation has a direction. They have goals that they have set, that they want to accomplish. And we have to include those voices on church councils. I think that's one thing that churches...
This isn't a mindless generation. These aren't people who are just like, well, we don't know what we're doing. These are people who are already in leadership positions.
Yeah.
Several of which are in executive level positions.
Right. Exactly.
And who are being told, you guys need to wait your turn.
Yeah.
This should seem so
wait
easy,
to get more
though.
experience.
This should seem so easy because it's the conversation of, these people are saying, well, what can we do to get this demographic in our doors? What can we do to better, market ourselves as friendly to this age group? Yeah. And then it's like, well, why don't you ask them? Why don't you bring them in and ask them? No. Like, we're not going to do that. Like that, So it's you want to appease that demographic, but you are not interested in including them in positions of importance for the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a major flaw of the church in general. I'm not saying that some churches aren't doing it right, because I think some of them are. But during my job hunt, I interviewed with churches all over the country. And I think a huge flaw of the Big C Church, especially the United States churches, that we stack our church leadership, our church councils, with boomers mm-hmm. and with Gen X. Mm-hmm. And I never once interviewed with a church council that included someone of my own age or someone who was, a little bit younger than I. It was usually all the people that had they always kind of highlighted how much wisdom was in the room, right, how much discernment was in the room. And it was like, you don't think that younger generations have wisdom, that have discernment, that have information that could be viable and important in this situation. And yeah, that was something that I noticed just in my own experience of, of interviewing, is that there was no inclusion of the younger generations. And it was because, in my opinion, a matter of trust.
Another stat that is in this article I want to talk about, the writer says in 1972, 92% of Americans said they were Christian. And this is a report by Pew. But by 2070, that number will drop to below 50%. And the number of, quote, religiously unaffiliated, unquote, Americans, or, quote, nuns, N-O-N-E-S, will probably outnumber those adhering to Christianity. So that we have the rise of the nuns. It's a new movie title. What do you think, Shawn? Yeah, and so the nuns, the people that just aren't affiliated with religion, and again, it comes right back to why we're even doing this podcast. We're spiritual, but we're not religious, and so we have these folks who just say, you know what, enough of it. We can go find God in other places. We can go find God on our own.
Whoa.
Oh, we got a little feedback there, don't we?
Yeah.
Okay.
It sounded like the old
Must be the
school.
nuns.
It was the nuns. They were coming.
It's not like an old school video game.
Episode 1.
Trying to reach out. Yeah, I think really what I'm getting from y'all's podcast, from listening to the last two, and really just kind of looking to the future, is trying to... I think you guys are on a journey as well of one, dissecting what's happening within the Big C Church, within the westernized Christianity realm. But I think there's also a search for where you guys fit in as well. And I mean, I might just be, shooting in the dark there, but hopefully I'm hitting some sort of point of, is this your journey towards being nuns as well? Not in the sense that, you completely throw away all connection with the Christian church and Jesus and, the pillars of Christianity. But is this kind of your journey towards, what's happening in the church and
Exactly.
what needs to happen? Yeah.
Yeah, and to give voice to folks who have been affected by that.
Yeah.
And want to be a part of the conversation that leads to, well, what do we want, or what do we need church to look like?
Yeah. And I think it's really cool what y'all are doing too, because in a sense, I think it's okay to step back and see what's happening, to see where you are. And I'm speaking to your viewers and your listeners as well, of, not feeling the shame of, I don't go to church, but more of, okay, sit back and think about where you are currently. Are your pillars strong? Do you believe in the things that, are structurally sound as far as your faith, and everything else can be left up to, to chance in a sense. I mean, God himself asks us to ask him questions and to, meet with him one-on-one and talk. So yeah, I don't know. It's really interesting what y'all are doing. And I feel like, if I could talk to anyone who's listening now, I know it might seem hopeless where you are and, how you're feeling, but know there's a larger movement that's happening right now that you might just fit into. But I would just urge you to find like-minded people like the Shawns and, sit down and have these conversations.
And as we kind of close up, I do want to give us a little bit of hope of things that are happening. There's a great book. It's called Greenhouses of Hope, and it's edited by Dory Baker. And I highly recommend you pick this up if you're looking for ways in which church communities, faith communities are growing in an age where church decline is on the rise, there's a little bit of hope here in this book of several different communities of faith that are experiencing some robust growth, not just in numbers, but in a holistic way, which I think is probably the desire of most faith communities. But in the book, she mentions that God will call young lives with or without the help of congregations. I think that's key. God's going to work regardless, which is great. God will bring them bursting through glass ceilings as they grow toward who they are called to be. But how much better and how much richer might the journey be if young people were not left to eke out their calling solo, but rather were given the best of their community's resources, attention, love, and nourishment toward their vocational flourishing. Like, how much better would their faith journey be? Where they wouldn't have to say, tell people, yeah, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Actually, I'm part of a thriving, beautiful community that is giving back, that is a loving community, and they are seeking out the most marginalized people, just the way that this guy Jesus did. And we want to be a part of that. And they're empowering us. They're inviting us into the conversation. They're inviting us into leadership roles.
We were never supposed to be perfect. That's the case in point. I think church is a place for sick people, just like a hospital is. It was never meant to be a place for perfect folks. That's what heaven is. Yeah. Here on earth we have this family, this body that's growing and that's changing, that sometimes a hand gets hacked off or blown away by a leaf blower.
And never gonna get rid of that leaf blower, are we?
No, he's doing a very thorough job here at the Asheville studios.
But
very appreciative of his efforts.
But no, I mean,
or her efforts,
or
their efforts.
And all in all, I think we just need to be compassionate, to build that trust again, and to move forward together into this unknown, but also have an open mind with where we're going. But I mean, at the very base of who we are, we need to keep our biblical pillars and standards, the same. Yeah. 'Cause that's what Jesus calls us to do.
Well, and by those pillars, are you talking about what?
I mean, that
like
God created the earth, that Jesus was born, and that he died, and then he rose again, and then he's coming back, and that's at the very base of who we are is what we're supposed to be. We've been given a charge by Jesus to bring his names to the end of the ends of the earth.
And I would take that a step further and say that even more important than those things, which are important, but I think, how can we love in the same way that Jesus loved?
Yeah.
Right. And in all of the different stories that we see Jesus mentioning, the parables, and even in his own life, who was he found with? He was found with the reprobates and the people that no one else wanted to associate with, the lepers and the sinners, and fill in the blank. And so how can we love in that manner, as that's foundational, right?
I think that's almost the basis of this new Reformation is love, because like it or not, we live in a post-Christian world. There's almost no corner of the earth now, except for maybe that island where if you step foot on the sand, they like spear you. There's no one who hasn't heard the name of Jesus. There's no one who hasn't heard of God or Christianity because of social media, because of the internet. I feel like we are living in this world where every corner has been touched. So what do we do now? We have to start touching the corners of the heart and of the soul.
Like actually putting our words into action now.
Well, imagine how different the world would be if we had done that to begin with.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you say that that's probably one of the most important pieces to this puzzle, is actually like loving people how Jesus loved us. When acts of service and outreach ministry is just kind of like this subsect of most churches now, where it's like, well, if you want to get in touch with our outreach ministry, then this is who you can talk to. And it's like, well, shouldn't this be like the core of what the idea is?
Yeah, and I think a string of hope for people in ministry, if I could give it to them, is it's okay for slow growth. Like, I think we're fighting this decline and we're saying, oh my gosh, like something has to change. We have to get more lights and more, more screens and more sound equipment. I think we have to do this to bring all these people back. When really, I think we need to just embrace what's happening, embrace the decline, and say slow change, slow growth is okay because of that very fact. If you look back at Acts, when they were adding thousands per day, it was because no one had heard of Jesus before. No one had heard the story. No one had heard of the miracles. It's just like when a new product hits the shelves, the new iPhone, like everyone runs and grabs it. And they say, oh my gosh, like this is amazing. Thousands of iPhones are being sold a day. Just like thousands of people were being added to the church. It was a new product. It was a new message. It was a new thing. And I think that's the reason why so many people, so many church leaders are getting burnt out, because they're not seeing the thousands added per day.
So what do? You have to adapt to that change by not changing the core of what you're teaching, but changing maybe how you deliver it to people. Exactly. And it's interesting because if you think about, in the next 100, 200 years, the future of the church. So say like what you're saying, what if the church embraces this progression that's happening, this evolution that's happening? What will the church look like in that time frame? Will it look like more traveling outreach communities? Will it look like, who knows? But I feel like what you're saying is right now it's kind of like it's being met with a lot of resistance and pushback. Like, no, we're not changing. We're gonna keep doing what we've done the past
just like
500
every
years.
Reformation has been met with the same resistance. When we just need to embrace what's happening. If that's any consolation to the leaders, I would say it's nothing that you're doing. It's just what's happening. Like it's one could say, and this is my opinion again, maybe it's the move of the Holy Spirit. He's showing people, he's showing leaders, he's showing churches the direction he wants to go in, and we need to just accept it.
Right.
Or she.
Yeah, it's true. Or they.
Or they. Yeah. So we're going to close on this last part of the article. And he says that aside, closures are often due to a failure of churches to adapt. And we were just talking about that. You just used that word, which signaled me to mention this. It says a church will go through a life cycle. At some point, maybe the congregation ages out. Maybe they stop reaching young families. And if the church ages and doesn't reach young people, or the demographics change and they don't figure out how to reach the new demographic, that church ends up closing. There's financial pressures that will close a church, but oftentimes it's more that they didn't figure out how to change when the community changed, or they didn't have enough young people to continue the congregation for the next generation. So this adaptability piece is interesting to me. Just final thoughts on that from both of you.
I'm actually really filled with hope when it comes to that. I go to a church here in Asheville with my family, and that's actually one thing that they spoke about a couple of weeks ago was the transition. They have an executive pastor who's on a 7-year plan of aging out, of finally stepping down. But what he's done is he's placed that, and I keep coming back to the overwhelming matter of trust. He's placed a lot of trust on this new lead pastor who is coming in, and he's like slowly taking over his responsibilities. And that was a huge thing. And that's actually something that he led with, was that same statistic of churches aging out with their lead pastors and saying, okay, like this church is either done or, something crazy happens and the church goes in a totally different direction. And I would say, and this is something, hopefully other churches are doing, and there's some hope in the Big C Church of these older executive pastors placing a lot of trust in my generation and the generation behind me and saying, okay, like, let's keep this momentum going. Let's show that both young and old can work together and trust each other and move forward. And I mean, it seems to be working really well for my congregation that I'm a part of.
Nice.
Yeah.
Shaun, any final thoughts from you?
I'm just thinking, we're talking about evolution. Some people might get a little, uptight about that word.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm very uptight. Listen,
Jesus fish doesn't turn into a Jesus frog.
Good Lord. Hey, listen, we want to hear your feedback on this. So
Gen Xers, man.
make sure you guys
are
make sure
jokes.
You give us your comments in the feed below or email us at
ask.us.snr@gmail.com. Man, I've been saying that in my sleep, son.
Love it. And thank you for joining us, Zach. It was a pleasure to have you on our podcast, and look forward to having you once again in the future. And really appreciate your ministry and your thoughts on this. And we are just so appreciative of all of you staying with us with the Spiritual Not Religious podcast. Again, send us your thoughts so we can share them online in the future. And join us for our next podcast, which we will finish up the third point. And we look forward to that very soon.
Nice. It was
All right.
fun.
Yeah, had a great time.
Yeah.
All right, we'll talk to you guys later.
All right. Thanks, guys.